So, welcome to the new year, and of course, well, we've got to talk about something that I think is really worrying, and that is the fact that I worry Boris Johnson is going to massively slide this country into authoritarianism. And this is something that apparently the Brexiteers really care about when it comes to protecting the UK democracy, and yet Boris Johnson has made somewhat very cryptic pledges to try and really take control of that to his own ends. Indeed, we have to massively fight his attempts to sort of increase the MPs, because what he's potentially going to do is split Conservative heartlands into two. So every one Conservative MP he gets, he now gets two. In fact, such rules would allow Boris Johnson to go from a majority of 84, which he got in the recent election, to, if it had been run with the potential changes he wants to do, from that to 104. Essentially ensuring that the Conservative Party will forever be in power. And the last time that happened, we had to have a massive landslide to the Labour government and Tony Blair to actually undo that damage that had been done by the Conservatives. We cannot allow that to happen, because then other things start to happen. And we'll get into that now with this article. So, with its lurch to the right, Britain is no longer special in Europe. Around Europe, the UK general election was followed with huge interest. Leftists were paying particularly close attention, as they understood that a victory for a genuine social democratic party would have an enormous impact on parties and movements around the continent and beyond. Meanwhile, in the brutally simplistic and ultimately effective methods of Boris Johnson Conservatives, we would also see echoes of our own recent elections, where the perceived strong leadership and appeals of a national pride struck a chord with many voters. For those of us living in Central Europe, this has been more than acute. The new British government looks familiar to anyone who's been paying attention to the politics of this region, particularly to Hungary, since Viktor Orban became Prime Minister again in 2010. In their manifesto, the Conservatives made a pledge to look at the broader aspects of our constitution, including the relationships between the three branches of government. It may be vague, but it sounds at least somewhat similar to the promises made by Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party. To reform the courts, the ongoing attempts by Orban's Friedrich Party to take control of the judiciary. Since the election, Johnson has made policy promises straight out of the Fritzton and PIS playbook, including threats against the media, crackdowns on traveller camps, and the creation of a dedicated immigration and borders department. The comparison between governments aren't exact, of course. While Johnson has used racist language on numerous occasions, he hasn't resorted to a clash of civilizations narrative like those repeated by the Fritzton or PSI in recent campaigns. And while those parties' campaigns identified national enemies, for Poland, the goddess west of Hungary, the threat of Islam, and wasn't a tactic employed by the Tories in this election. But they have all been too happy to rail against the enemies of Brexit in the past, whether it's judges, bureaucrats, or MPs, and they will surely do so again. Let's not forget either that the Conservatives have a direct link to those Central European parties. Johnson has met Donald Trump's former strategist, Steve Bannon, who has attempted to create a grand alliance of European nationalists. No doubt there will be claims that the UK, with its venerable institutions, couldn't possibly be prone to the same kind of constitutional meddling as in Hungary or Poland. But for all the abuses of power by the Fritzton and the PSI, they are still reined in to an extent by the EU. Governments in this region tend to be too scared of the threat of Brussels cutting their funding and aware of the overwhelming popularity of EU membership to risk serious censure by meddling too far. The UK is now free from this sort of concern, so the only barriers to the Conservatives' potential reforms will be media scrutiny and the judiciary. Unfortunately for the press, another manifesto promise was to kill off the Leveson inquiry and promote freedom of speech. And this I find, once again, quite worrying. Now, this is going to be find bizarre because people will say, oh, but what about all these other freedom of speech issues you said are rubbish in the past? Well, they have been completely and absolutely rubbish. The problem is now that you have a man who wants to take out the media and the Leveson inquiry purely because he has been funded heavily by press barons who want the Leveson inquiry removed so that they can just get on spouting propaganda, start printing what they want, start harassing people. The Leveson inquiry is really important. Unfortunately, it didn't go quite far enough, and here we are. So it will be funny to see, shall we say, if the free speech warriors actually stand up to when these issues actually come forward. But then we'll see. Unfortunately for the public, the Prime Minister's first soiree following the election was a party held by a media magnate. The Downing Street is already making threats to the future of the BBC. Our region is no simple lesson for the UK's left and centre. If anything can be learnt, it is that the meeting of the right on its own terms is a recipe for obliteration. There are no recent examples of normality left-wing parties successfully flirting with the closed-border nationalism or neoliberalism, whereas there are several attempts of this approach leading to electoral disaster. As well as the more obvious Western examples of Germany's Social Democrats or France's socialists, the decline of Poland's formerly dominant Democratic Left Alliance in the 2000s was due in part to its decision to join George Bush's coalition of the willing. What seems striking from afar is that Labour has successfully attracted a swathe of younger voters and long-term campaigners who were forced out by the decisions of the Blair years. It would be a terrible mistake if the party now drove them away. In the Polish elections this October, the left managed to find a happy medium between the old guard and the young activists, in no small part thanks to the older, more established group of the SLD, swallowing some pride and accepting that they may need help refreshing their ideas. Subsequently, the once rival groups formed an alliance and ran a positive campaign unusual for Poland and didn't focus on attacking enemies. As divided parties, they had been polling at levels that wouldn't have returned any MPs together. They returned the left wing to Parliament and have successfully recently polled within a few points of the main opposition. Many of the alliance's candidates were former locals as long-term activists from the areas they were standing in. Not always something seen in Britain, and in its safe seats and the parachuted-in candidates. In the wake of such a crushing blow for Labour and the left, Britain is beginning to realise that it is not as special as people, even those watching from overseas, assumed. Its government is starting to look just like another authoritarian European one, and it is now clear that the hallowed institutions which run on the gentlemen's agreements and the conventions are, if anything, more prone to abuse than those in Central and Eastern Europe. No country's situation is exactly acknowledged to another. But in a universal lesson, it seems that drifting to the right does not make a party more electable. It simply drives a country of left-wing deprives the country of left-wing politicians, just as in Poland over the past 4 years. At a time when the most vulnerable in UK society could be about to lose the few protections afforded to them by the admittedly imperfect EU. That would be an even greater disaster than the election itself. I completely agree with that. We don't know what's going to happen with Labour at the moment, but I will certainly be keeping an eye on it. And my advice to the old guard, to Momentum, swallow your pride and talk to each other. Because You have to look at the ideas. You have to look at the ideas you both agree on. Look at those ideas, build that common ground, and then go from there. And don't argue, discuss those ideas with, New Labour. You might not like people who are openly identify as Blairites, but they were the party that won probably one of the biggest election landslides in political history. So, to an extent, they should be absolutely listened to, even if you don't like Tony Blair. Now, I think him saying that the leftist policies of the Labour Party and that there won't be electable is ridiculous, because you can go and look at polls of just purely policy, not attached to a party, but when policies are put forward, they are unanimously popular. And what we need to be doing, really, Labour need to be really doing over the next 4 years is picking 4 key policy areas, and those are them. Now, one thing I definitely agree that the manifesto, even though it was a brilliant manifesto, was far too overstuffed. So, pick 4 things. End austerity. That's a good idea. Investment. Excellent. Go for it. Do it. Do something about universal credit. Universal credit is universally hated. The other thing is propose a dynamic and revolutionary solution to the housing crisis. Those 4 things, I think, are going to dominate the underlying core of British political life, at least until the next election. So focus on those. Show that, why are those ideas good, why they are will be successful for the country, win the next election, and do it, and then just keep on going and going with those policies. The Labour manifesto pretty much had really good policies for almost the next 4 or 5 next general elections. So that would be my advice. I don't know if anyone out there from Momentum or Labour is watching, but there you go.